Welcome to Stories from the Front. Take a second to like, subscribe, and activate notifications. The heat of Peleliu continues to burn in my memories. Clint Randall from the 1st Regiment of the 1st Marine Division, and at the age of 97, I still feel the weight of that Pacific island in 1944. Every scream, every explosion, every moment of that tropical hell remains etched in my mind with the precision of a clock. Our arrival on Peleliu seemed routine at first. The command assured us that it would be a quick operation, perhaps 3 or 4 days to conquer the island. What a terrible mistake. No one imagined that this small piece of coral would turn into one of the most brutal battlefields of the war. I remember the first day as if it were yesterday. We were on the LST landing ship tank, approaching the beach, and the silence was deafening. My platoon mates Frank Morrison, Pete Garcia, and young Billy Matthews tried to keep their composure, but their eyes revealed the fear we all shared. The first burst of Japanese artillery hit our neighboring LST. The sound of the explosion was followed by screams I'll never forget. The sea water, once crystal clear, turned red. Our boat managed to reach the beach, and when the ramp lowered, all hell broke loose. The terrain was unlike anything we had trained on. Razor-sharp coral tore at our boots, and the heat, my God, the heat. The temperature easily reached 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and our canteens emptied quickly. I saw strong men, trained for war, succumb to dehydration before they even faced the enemy. The Japanese had turned the island into a fortress. Every rocky ridge hid a firing position. Every cave housed soldiers determined to fight to the death. Colonel Nakagawa, the Japanese commander, had prepared a defense system that made perfect use of the rugged terrain. Morrison, my best friend since basic training, was hit on the second day. We were advancing toward the position when a burst of machine gun fire caught him. His last words were about his wife in Kansas. I had to leave him behind, something that torments me to this day. The nights were almost worse than the days. The Japanese carried out night raids, shouting and charging at our positions. The sound of blades and the noise of hand-to-hand battle haunt me in recurring nightmares. Pete Garcia saved my life on one of those nights, taking out an enemy soldier seconds before he reached me. The lack of drinking water was our worst enemy. The few wells on the island were contaminated or destroyed. We saw men begging for water, their lips cracked and their tongues swollen. Some tried to drink seawater, which only made their situation worse. Young Billy Matthews succumbed to dehydration on the 4th day, raving about his mother in his last moments. The caves were another nightmare in themselves. The Japanese had created an interconnected network of tunnels and bunkers. Each entrance was a potential death trap. We lost a lot of good men trying to clear these positions. The use of flamethrowers became commonplace, but the smell, that horrible smell of burning flesh, never left my memory. The worst thing was the bodies. Under that intense heat, decomposition was rapid. The stench of death permeated everything. Our clothes, our equipment, our skin. Some men couldn't stand it and vomited constantly. Others simply stopped smelling it, their senses dulled by the constant horror. After a week, we were no longer the same men who landed on that island. The war had transformed us into something different. We saw in each other's eyes a profound change, a loss of innocence that would never be recovered. Pete said that we had left our souls on those coral beaches. The days dragged on, and every meter of ground gained cost American lives. The Japanese fought with fanatical determination, preferring to die rather than surrender. Their defensive positions were so well constructed that it took us several attempts to conquer a single elevation. The experience on Peleliu taught me that war has no glory. There is no romanticized heroism when you see your friends dying in horrible ways, when you have to fight not only the enemy, but the hostile environment itself. True heroism lies in the ability to maintain humanity in the midst of total chaos. Those who have never been in combat cannot truly understand what it means to be in a situation where every moment could be your last, where fear becomes a constant companion, and where the line between survival and madness becomes dangerously thin. As we made our way around the island, the caves became our main challenge. The Japanese had transformed Peleliu's natural cave system into an impressive underground fortress. Every entrance was a possible death sentence, and we knew it. I can still hear the echo of gunfire reverberating off the rocky walls, mixed with the screams of agony coming from the depths. Pete Garcia, who had become my constant partner after Morrison's death, developed a peculiar method for checking the cave entrances. He would throw stones and listen carefully to the sound they made when they fell. "That I know if there's someone in there, Randall," he would say. "Sounds never lie." His instinct saved us several times. The heat inside those tunnels was even worse than outside. The air was saturated with a mixture of gunpowder, sweat, and decay. Our uniforms were soaked in minutes, and thirst was a constant torture. Some men began to hallucinate due to severe dehydration. I particularly remember a mission to clear a cave complex near what we called the High Point. It was me, Pete, and 3 other men from the platoon. Sergeant Wilson gave us specific orders to use white phosphorus grenades, a terrible weapon, but effective against entrenched enemies. As we entered the first tunnel, the darkness was almost palpable. Our flashlights created dancing shadows on the walls, and every movement seemed amplified by the sepulchral silence. Young Martinez, who had only joined the platoon 2 weeks ago, was visibly shaking. He wouldn't last long in that hell. It was in this complex that we found something I'll never forget: an underground Japanese hospital. The enemy doctors and nurses had refused to abandon their patients. When we entered, they were all dead, some from wounds, others from ritual suicide. The sight of that scene made me question everything I thought about the enemy. Pete always said that war robs us of pieces of our soul. But in the Peleliu caves, I felt I was losing much more than that. Every shot, every grenade thrown, every scream in the dark was transforming us into something we no longer recognized. The fear was no longer of the enemy, but of ourselves. The Japanese had developed specific tactics for fighting in caves. They waited until the last possible moment to attack, often sacrificing themselves in suicide attacks that took several of us with them. We learned never to let our guard down, even when a cave seemed empty. One particularly difficult night, we were trapped in a tunnel during an artillery bombardment. The sound was deafening, and the ground shook with every impact. Martinez began to pray in Spanish, his words mixing with the noise of the explosions. Pete held his hand the whole time. Even though he was a man who never showed much affection, water became more precious than ammunition. We shared the last sips from our canteens as if they were liquid gold. I saw men crying with joy when we managed to find a source of drinking water. Others were slowly losing their sanity, their minds melting from the heat and thirst. The worst were the night raids. The Japanese knew every inch of those tunnels and used that to their advantage. They moved like ghosts in the darkness, appearing and disappearing before we could react. We lost many good men this way, including Martinez, who was silently killed during his watch. After 2 weeks in that underground hell, we began to develop a sixth sense. We could sense the presence of the enemy before we saw him, identify traps by the slightest detail out of place. Pete called it cave instinct, but I knew it was just the constant fear keeping us alive. The fight for the Peleliu caves taught us that war isn't just about killing or dying. It's about surviving yourself, keeping your sanity when everything around you invites madness. Every day was a new battle, not just against the enemy, but against our own inner demons. The battle for the caves had transformed us, but the true test of our humanity was yet to come. As we advanced deeper into the island, the tunnel system gave way to an even more treacherous terrain, the Coral Plateau. It was an elevated area that the Japanese had transformed into an almost impenetrable fortress. Pete and I had survived the caves, but something in his eyes had changed. He no longer made his usual jokes about Brooklyn, and his hands trembled slightly when he lit his cigarettes. The weight of losing Martinez still consumed him, and I knew that guilt would stay with him forever. Our unit was ordered to take up a Japanese defensive position on top of the plateau. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the coral beneath our feet radiated a heat that seemed to come from hell itself. Our water supplies were critically low, and the refueling helicopters were unable to land due to intense enemy fire. It was during this operation that we met Sergeant Henderson, a veteran from Guadalcanal who had been transferred to our unit. He had a look that you only get after seeing too much of the war. "Guys," he told us, "here we're not just fighting the Japanese, we're fighting our own nature." Advancing across the plateau was an exercise in patience and endurance. Every step had to be calculated, as the Japanese had positioned snipers in small crevices in the coral, almost invisible from a distance. We lost Private Phillips that way. A single clear shot when he got up to get a drink of water. Thirst became our cruelest enemy. I saw strong men crying like children, begging for water. Some started licking the dew off the rocks in the morning. Others chewed leaves in the hope of extracting some moisture. Pete developed the method of collecting water from the condensation on our tarpaulins, but it was barely enough to keep a man alive. Sergeant Henderson taught us how to survive in that hostile environment. He showed us how to spot the subtle signs of enemy positions. Small changes in the coloration of rocks, irregular patterns in the shadows. "War is 90% observation," he said, "and 10% action." One particularly hot afternoon, we found a group of dead Japanese soldiers near an abandoned command post. What shocked us was not the sight of the bodies. We were sadly used to that, but the letters and photographs scattered around them. They were people just like us, with families, dreams, and fears. Pete collected the letters in silence, a gesture of respect that reminded me that there was still humanity in us. The fight for the plateau taught us a new dimension of horror. The Japanese had developed a system of tunnels that connected different points on the high ground. They could appear anywhere, at any time. We slept in shifts, always alert, always waiting for the next attack. One night, during my watch, I heard a soft sound of stones moving. I silently alerted my unit, and we prepared for an attack. What followed was one of the most intense battles I've ever experienced. The Japanese emerged from several directions simultaneously, in a last desperate attempt to dislodge us from the position. Pete was wounded during the fighting, a piece of grenade shrapnel hitting his shoulder. Even though he was bleeding, he kept firing, protecting our position. Sergeant Henderson coordinated our defense with surreal calm, as if he were conducting a training exercise rather than a battle for survival. The morning revealed the cost of that night. Dozens of Japanese bodies lay around our position, and 3 of ours had fallen. The rising sun painted the coral plateau in shades of red, as if the island itself was bleeding from all the lives lost on its surface. The coral plateau had taken its toll, but the true cost of the war was beginning to show in our minds. Pete was slowly recovering from a shoulder injury, but his nights were plagued by nightmares. Sergeant Henderson said it was normal, that we all carried our own inner battles. The Japanese had retreated to their last line of defense, a series of fortified positions we called Bloody Hill. The name wasn't just because of the reddish color of the coral, but because of the price and lives we knew it would cost to take it. Our unit, already halved, was ordered to take part in the assault. The lack of water continued to be our greatest torment. I noticed changes in my comrades: sunken eyes, cracked lips, parched skin. One of the new recruits, Johnson, started hallucinating during a patrol. He swore he saw a crystal-clear lake in front of us, and we had to physically restrain him to stop him running into enemy fire. Sergeant Henderson gathered what was left of our unit to plan the attack. "We are no longer the same men who landed here," he said, his words laden with truth. "But that's precisely why we'll survive. We've learned to fight not only against the enemy, but against our own limits." Pete, his arm still in a makeshift sling, insisted on taking part in the assault. "I didn't come all this way to watch from the back," he muttered. I realized that his determination was no longer about patriotism or duty. It was about revenge, about Martinez, about all the friends we had lost on that damned island. The attack began at dawn. Naval artillery opened the way, but the Japanese had built up positions so deep that the shelling seemed only to scratch the surface of their defenses. We advanced under heavy fire, using every depression in the terrain as cover. It was during this advance that I witnessed something that would change my perspective forever. A Japanese soldier, wounded and surrounded, instead of surrendering or fighting to the death, began to sing. It was a soft melody, almost a lullaby. When we approached, he simply smiled and detonated a grenade, taking 2 of our men with him. Sergeant Henderson was hit while leading an assault on a machine gun position. His last words were in order to keep moving. Pete took command of our unit, his natural leadership emerging amid the chaos. His raspy voice guided our actions, keeping us focused despite our fatigue and fear. The battle dragged on for hours that seemed like days. The merciless sun turned our positions into furnaces, and the constant sound of gunfire and explosions created a macabre symphony. I saw men gradually losing their sanity, their gazes becoming vacant, their actions mechanical. One scene in particular stuck in my memory. We found a Japanese bunker with its entire garrison dead from ritual suicide. On a makeshift table, there were dozens of letters addressed to relatives in Japan. Pete ordered us to collect them all, because one day, he said, this war will end, and someone needs to tell their stories too. The advance continued, meter by meter, life by life. We used flamethrowers to clear the fortified positions, and the smell of burning flesh mixed with the omnipresent odor of gunpowder and death. Some men vomited. Others simply stopped reacting to the horrors around them. As the afternoon approached, we realized that we were changing not just physically, but in our essence. The war had stripped us of any illusions about glory or heroism. We were survivors, nothing more, fighting not for grandiose ideals, but for the simple chance to see another dawn. Johnson, the recruit who had been hallucinating, proved his worth that day. After regaining lucidity, he became one of our best marksmen, his accuracy almost supernatural. It's easier to hit the target, he once said, when you no longer care whether you live or die. As the battle for Bloody Hill intensified, our unit faced not only the enemy, but also our own psychological limits. Pete, still leading despite the wound to his shoulder, had become a shadow of the playful man I knew at the beginning. His eyes carried a weight that words could not describe. One particularly difficult afternoon, we were ordered to clear a bunker complex that the Japanese had turned into a forward command point. The heat was so intense that our helmets felt like ovens over our heads. Johnson, who had become our best sniper, positioned himself strategically to give us cover. The operation began methodically, as Henderson had taught us. We checked every corner, every shadow, aware that a single mistake could cost several lives. That's when we found something that would change our perception of the enemy forever. A small makeshift Buddhist shrine, with photographs of families and letters yet to be sent. Pete ordered a momentary pause, something unusual in the midst of battle. Look, he said, pointing to the photographs, they too have something to fight for. That moment of humanity amid the chaos of war hit us like a punch in the gut. For a few moments, we forgot that we were on opposite sides. Our contemplation was interrupted by a nearby explosion. The Japanese had detected our presence and launched a fierce counterattack. Johnson, from his elevated position, began eliminating targets with surgical precision, but there were too many. The deafening sound of explosions was mixed with war cries in Japanese. In the midst of the chaos, I realized that some of our men were beginning to lose control. Young Roberts, who had only joined the unit 2 weeks ago, went into such a state of panic that we had to drag him to a shelter. His eyes were glazed over, completely disconnected from reality. Pete organized our defense with surprising calm, considering the circumstances. "Stand firm," he shouted above the din of battle. With a last line between them and our main position, his words kept us focused. Even when everything around us seemed to be falling apart, the fight stretched into the night, something the Japanese often used to their advantage. The dark turned every shadow into a potential enemy, every noise into a deadly threat. We used illuminating rockets to light up the battlefield, creating a macabre spectacle of light and shadow. It was during that night that I witnessed something that would haunt me forever. A group of Japanese soldiers, surrounded and out of ammunition, performed a collective ritual before charging against our positions with bayonets and swords. Their determination was both terrifying and admirable. Johnson, from his position, muttered a prayer before doing what needed to be done. The morning revealed the true cost of that night. The ground was covered in bodies on both sides, and the red coral looked even darker with the spilled blood. Pete gathered the survivors together for a quick moment of reflection. "Every man here," he said, "will carry this night with them forever. But this is how we honor those we've lost, by continuing to fight." Our water was almost gone, and the promised supplies still hadn't arrived due to enemy anti-aircraft fire. We started licking the dew off the rocks in the morning, an act that weeks before would have seemed unthinkable. Thirst had a unique way of breaking a man's pride. After his collapse, Roberts found a peculiar way of dealing with the trauma. He began to write compulsively in a small notebook he carried with him. "I'm documenting everything," he explained, "because no one at home would believe me if I just told them." His words carried a painful truth that we all felt. The battle for Bloody Hill had turned us into something we barely recognized. Pete, with his shoulders still unhealed, led our reduced unit with a quiet determination. Johnson continued to be our watchful eye, and Roberts wouldn't let go of his notebook, as if documenting the horror could somehow make it more bearable. Our water ran out completely that morning. The request for supplies had been denied due to intense Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Pete gathered what was left of our unit, just 12 men out of the original 45. "We have two options," he said, his voice hoarse from thirst. "Fall back for resupply, or take that Japanese command position that might have supplies." The decision was unanimous. No one wanted to abandon the ground for which we had paid such a high price in lives. Johnson identified a pattern in the enemy patrols that could give us a small window of opportunity to attack. "They change the guard every 4 hours," he observed. "There's always a moment of vulnerability." The plan was risky, but thirst made us reckless. Roberts, who had found new courage through his notes, offered to lead the distraction. "I'll make it look like a bigger attack than it really is," he said, showing a maturity that previous fear had masked. As we prepared, I found Pete staring at a faded photograph of his wife. "You know, Randall," he muttered, "I've never told her about the real hell this place is. How could I? Some things are too heavy to share." His words echoed a feeling we all carried. The attack began at dusk. Roberts and 3 men initiated a series of controlled explosions with our last grenades, creating the illusion of a large-scale assault. Johnson, from his elevated position, methodically eliminated any Japanese who tried to identify our real number. Pete led our main team through a depression in the terrain that we had identified as a blind spot in the enemy defenses. The coral cut into our hands and knees as we crawled, but thirst was a greater motivator than pain. Every meter gained was a battle against our own exhaustion. When we reached the perimeter of the Japanese command post, we witnessed something extraordinary. The defenders, also suffering from a lack of water, had begun a ritual that looked like a farewell ceremony. Their voices sang a low, melancholy chant that made Robert stop writing in his notebook for the first time in days. The fight that followed was unlike anything we had ever experienced. It was no longer about ideology or flags. It was about survival, pure and simple. Men on both sides fought with a determination born of desperation, each knowing that position meant the difference between life and death. Pete was hit again during the final assault, this time in the chest. As I held him, he whispered something that would change my perspective forever. "Take care of the cards, Randall. All of them. Ours and theirs. Someone needs to tell this whole story." They were his last words before he left. The position was taken at dusk. We found not only the water supplies we so desperately needed, but also something more valuable: humanity. Among the military documents were diaries and letters telling stories of love, longing, and hope, not unlike our own. Johnson came down from his observation position for the last time, his rifle still warm. "Never again," he said simply, setting the gun aside and helping to tend to the wounded, both allies and enemies who had survived. Roberts continued writing, his words now documenting not only horror, but also moments of unexpected compassion. When night finally fell on Peleliu, I sat among the rubble of the command post, holding the letters Pete had asked me to preserve. The moon illuminated the red coral, and for the first time in weeks, I felt tears flowing freely. They weren't just tears of sadness, but of understanding, of the futility of war and the importance of maintaining our humanity even in the darkest moments. Peleliu taught us that war has no real victors, only survivors who bear the visible and invisible scars of conflict. The stories contained in those letters, both ours and the enemy's, became my legacy, a testament to the humanity that persists even in the deepest of hells. Now, so many decades later, I still keep my promise to Pete. The letters are preserved, their stories translated and shared, reminding the world that under different uniforms beat similar hearts, all dreaming of the day they could return home.